The transport van was already parked in my driveway when I came out for the newspaper.
White panel sides, a logo I didn't recognize, something with a sunrise on it, the kind of logo that's supposed to make an ending look like a beginning. Two men stood by the back doors, not talking, the way men stand when we've done a job enough times that it no longer requires conversation. Vanessa was on the porch in a blazer the color of wet sand, holding a clipboard against her chest like a shield.
"Mother Calloway," she said. "She only called me that when other people were listening. The transport's a little early. That's all right. We'll just get you settled." I looked at the van, I looked at the men, I looked at the folder in Vanessa's other hand, and I let my mouth go soft and confused, the particular slackness I had practiced in the bathroom mirror for 3 nights running. "Settled where?" I said. Not a question. A woman who has lost the shape of a question. "We talked about this, remember? The nice place with the garden?" I did not remember, because it had never been a conversation. It had been a document, filed on a Tuesday, granted on a Thursday, and delivered to my kitchen table by a sheriff's deputy who apologized twice before he handed it to me. Temporary emergency guardianship. My name under a heading that used the words incapacitated person, as though it were a diagnosis, instead of an opinion somebody had paid for. I bent down, slow, the way my knees actually do go slow now, 65 years asking a body to keep doing what it once did for free. I retied a bootlace that didn't need retying. Under the tongue of the boot, folded into a square the size of a stamp, was Renata's name and number. Insurance, in case a phone call from me was the one thing they'd choose not to believe. I pressed it flat against my ankle, close enough to hand to Josie without a word if it came to that, and stood back up with my face arranged into nothing at all. Behind Vanessa, through the screen door, I could see the kitchen counter, and on it, a cardboard box someone had already started filling with things for my life. On top, catching the morning light, sat an old olive drab field radio, dust thick on its dial, waiting to be thrown away, like it had never worked a day in its life. "Ma'am, if you'll just come with us," the taller of the two men said. He had the gentled voice people learned for this exact job, the one that tries to sound like an invitation and lands like a diagnosis. "We'll take good care of you." "Take good care of me where?" I said, and let the question wobble, like a compass that can't find north. He glanced at Vanessa, uncertain, the way people do when the paperwork says one thing and the person in front of them says another. That flicker of doubt was worth noting. Men who move the elderly for a living see confusion every day of their working lives. It takes a particular kind of performance to make one of them pause. It had worked exactly one day in its life that mattered. I was 3 weeks away from proving it still could. 3 weeks earlier, I had been standing at that same counter, portioning 7 days of medication into a plastic organizer, with the kind of precision that had once kept men alive at 9,000 feet in a shaking helicopter. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I did it without looking, the way you check a runway you've walked 1,000 times. Derek came by that evening the way he'd started coming by lately, unannounced, a little too observant, asking questions that sounded like conversation and functioned like an inventory.
"You eating okay, Mom?"
"I'm eating fine, Derek."
"You remember Vanessa's showing that place out on Route 9 tomorrow? The big one?"
"I remember you told me that yesterday." He smiled like I'd passed something. He didn't know I'd clocked the smile, the way you clock a patient's breathing before you clock anything they say. He wandered while we talked, the way he used to as a boy, touching things that weren't his, the drawer where I kept the bank statements, the corner of one sticking half out. On his way past the hallway, he walked, as he always had, beneath the small framed photograph hanging there, without giving it a glance. A grainy shot of 2 soldiers crouched beside a helicopter skid, faces streaked with dusk, and something that might have been blood, or might have been mud. He'd grown up walking past that photograph, on his way to the bathroom. He had never once asked who the younger soldier was, kneeling beside me with his arm braced against the airframe, waiting for a stretcher that had not yet arrived. I had never told him. It hadn't seemed like the kind of thing a boy needed carried into his own life. Back at the drawer, I watched him angle his phone toward the statement without quite lifting it to his face, the shutter sound muffled, but not muffled enough.
A line item on it, circled in memory, though not in ink. Sato Whitfield Consulting Retainer, $9,000, deposited on the 15th, the way it had been deposited on the 15th of every month for 11 years.
He didn't ask what it was. He photographed it instead. That told me more than any question would have. He left with a half a peach pie I hadn't offered him and a picture he thought I hadn't seen him take. At his own kitchen table that night, apparently, he showed the photograph to his wife. I wasn't there for that conversation, obviously. I only came to understand its shape later, the way you reconstruct a fracture from an X-ray instead of watching the fall. But Josie was there, 12 years old and supposedly asleep on the couch with a book over her face, and Josie has her grandmother's gift for looking unconscious while remaining extremely awake. $9,000 a month from somewhere called Sato Whitfield, Derek said. You think that's the county? Social Security doesn't pay like that. It doesn't matter where it's from, Vanessa said. There was a particular flatness to her voice when money was involved, like a door closing on a spring hinge. What matters is whether she's competent to manage it, and whether that land out there is finally going to do something besides sit there costing us in property tax. It's not costing us anything. It's hers. Derek. A pause, the kind that isn't really a pause, just a woman deciding how much truth the man can carry. There's 40 acres of dead weight sitting on the edge of a firing range nobody's used since Reagan was president. If we get ahead of things, we control how this goes. If we wait, some judge decides for us, and your mother ends up somewhere a lot worse than a place with a garden. Derek didn't answer right away. Josie, under her book, went very still. Getting ahead of things turned out to be a specific phrase with a specific meaning, and I would hear it again, almost word for word, in a filed legal document 3 days later. The dinner where they built their evidence happened on a Thursday. Vanessa cooked, which she never did, pot roast that filled the house with a smell that made me suspicious before a single question was asked. She sat across from me with her phone face down beside her fork, not quite hidden, the screen dark but the microphone, I would learn later, very much alive. Gus, do you remember what day Frank passed? March, I said, and let it hang a half second too long, watching her lean in almost imperceptibly toward the phone. The 11th, Tuesday. It rained. I let my eyes drift to the window as though the date cost me something to retrieve, when in truth I could have told her the hour. And Josie's birthday? Do you remember that? Under the table, a small sneakered foot found my ankle and pressed, once, hard. A warning, or a comfort, or both. I looked at my granddaughter, and she looked back at me, with an expression 12-year-olds aren't supposed to have, and somehow all of them do. The one that says, I see what you're doing, and I don't understand it, but I trust you anyway. October, I said, vaguely, and watched Vanessa's shoulders settle, satisfied, the way a fisherman settles when the line finally goes tight. Later, on the porch, after they'd gone, Josie told me about the phone. She does that a lot now, record stuff. Dad doesn't know I noticed. You noticed? I said. That's good work, soldier. I'm not a soldier. No, I agreed. You're better. Nobody's paying you to notice things, and you do it anyway. I brought out the radio that night, the same one that would end up in a cardboard box 3 weeks later. I showed her the frequency dial, the worn olive paint, the toggle switch that still clicked with the same particular resistance it had clicked with in a supply tent outside Duran in 1991. Does it still work? She asked. I didn't answer her directly. I only said, some things look old because people stopped asking them to do anything. The next morning, I told Derek I was driving into town for groceries. That was true, technically, the way most useful lies are built on a foundation of something true. I bought bread, I bought coffee, and in the gravel lot outside the hardware store, waiting for the truck's air conditioning to catch up with the Texas heat, I heard Vanessa's voice through the open window of her car, 3 spaces down, her back to me, phone against her ear. No, listen, the appraisal doesn't matter yet. We just need the emergency order first. Once she's declared incapacitated, Derek's the guardian, and I control the guardian. She won't even remember signing anything. She'll just remember somebody was kind to her. A pause, a laugh, small and private, the kind people only make when they believe no one worth impressing is listening. It's 40 acres of nothing, next to a fence the Army stopped caring about before I was born. Get me a buyer lined up quiet,
and we can have this closed before Thanksgiving."
I did not move. I did not gasp or drop my keys or do any of the things a woman in a story is supposed to do at a moment like that. I stood very still between the smell of diesel and the ring of the hardware store's door chime, and I did what 20 years of triage had trained into me before I ever had children of my own to protect. I cataloged, and I knew exactly what I was going to do about none of them out loud. That night in my kitchen, I did not cry, and I did not call Derek to confront him, and I want to be honest about why, because I've thought about it since. It wasn't wisdom. It was 30 years of learning that the person who reacts first in a crisis is rarely the one who ends up in control of it. You don't yell across a helicopter bay when the pressure drops. You check your line, you check your patient, and then you act. There is a version of this instinct I have never told anyone in my family about. Not Frank, not Derek, not even Josie, who I suspect would understand it better than either of them. In February of 1991, we lost a corporal on the return leg of a run out of Kavshi, not from his wounds, which were survivable, but from a delay. 20 minutes we never fully accounted for, a communication gap between two units that should have talked to each other and didn't. I was the ranking medical officer on that airframe. I have spent 34 years since then believing, in some quiet, unexamined chamber of myself, that if I had asked for help sooner, loudly enough, insistently enough, he might have lived. I never asked for help loudly again after that. I got very good at solving things alone, quietly, before anyone else even understood there was a problem to solve. It is, I recognize now, both the reason I survived what came for me at 65 and the reason nobody in my own family saw it coming until a judge's gavel forced them to. I gave that memory exactly as much room as it needed, and not 1 minute more. Grief was a luxury the next few hours could not afford. I called Renata Ford at 9 that evening, a number I'd kept in my phone for 11 years without ever needing it, filed under a name that meant nothing to anyone who might scroll through my contacts. She answered on the second ring, the voice of someone who has learned not to be surprised by late calls from elderly clients. "Gus, what's happened?" "My daughter-in-law is filing for guardianship over me. She's already told someone she plans to sell the back 40 before Thanksgiving." There was a silence on the line, the particular silence of a professional recalculating a whole week. "Has anything been filed yet?" "Not that I know of. Not yet." "Then we move first, and we move quiet. I'm going to want an independent evaluation on record before she gets a doctor of her own choosing anywhere near you. Don't sign anything. Don't argue with her. Let her think she's winning for now. A woman who thinks she's already won stops being careful." I looked across the kitchen at the radio on the counter, dust already starting to settle on the dial, even though I'd used it 18 hours earlier. I thought about Marcus Webb, and the last time I'd used that radio for something that mattered, and what it would cost me, professionally, personally, to reach for that particular kind of help before I absolutely had to. I decided I absolutely had to. The next morning, before the heat came up, I walked out to the equipment shed at the edge of the property, the one Derek always said I should tear down, and I sat on an overturned bucket with the old radio in my lap and turned the dial to a frequency I had promised myself I would never use for anything but an emergency. It took 11 minutes to raise anyone. It took 40 more seconds once I did for the voice on the other end to place mine. Lieutenant Colonel Calloway. Marcus Webb's voice hadn't aged the way the rest of him probably had. Command voices rarely do. It has been a long time since anyone's used this channel for anything but testing the batteries. "I need a favor, Marcus. Not the kind you can just hand out, the kind that has to come through the right door." I told him what I knew, not everything, because I still didn't know everything, but enough. A guardianship filing, a daughter-in-law with a real estate license, and a debt I didn't yet understand the size of. 40 acres that happened to sit inside a lease his people had signed with me 15 years earlier, the kind of lease that came with clauses about disclosure and continuity that most families never think to read. I can't ride out there myself, Gus. You know that. I can't intervene in a civilian guardianship matter because we're friends, and if I tried, it would poison every bit of good it might do you. I'm not asking you to ride out here, Marcus. I'm asking you to make sure somebody who has to notice, notices. There was a pause,
And in it, I could hear him doing exactly what I had done in that gravel parking lot, cataloging. "That," he said finally, "I can do. That's not friendship. That's compliance."
"I know the difference, Marcus. I've known it since Kofshi." He was quiet for a moment on the other end, and I understood he'd heard exactly what I meant him to hear and chosen not to say anything about it, which was its own kind of mercy. "Your lease renewal came across my desk again last spring," he said instead. $47 million over the life of it, all told. Most lessors I deal with call twice a year, just to remind us they exist. You've never called once. Not for anything.
Didn't think I needed to.
"No," he agreed. "You never did. That's rather the point I intend to make, if it comes to it." I did not ask him what he meant by that. I have learned, across a long career of working alongside men like Marcus Webb, that the ones worth trusting rarely explain themselves in advance, and the explaining, when it comes, tends to arrive exactly on time, and not 1 minute sooner. I did not tell Renata about that call. I did not tell Derek. I told no one but the radio and the dust it had been sitting in, and I set it back on the counter where it had been, and I went inside and made coffee. And when Derek called that afternoon to ask, very casually, whether I'd been feeling more confused lately, I said, "Some days are harder than others," and let him hear exactly what he wanted to hear. Vanessa's petition was filed 11 days later. I wasn't in the courtroom for that first hearing. Emergency temporary orders rarely require the subject's presence, which is precisely why they are dangerous, and precisely why she chose that route. Judge Patricia Kell heard the case in the county's smaller courtroom, on a docket crowded with a dozen other matters that had nothing to do with me: a landlord dispute, 2 traffic appeals, a name change for a young man who had waited 18 months for his turn. In front of her was a sworn statement describing a woman who forgot her own son's face on bad days, who had recently signed and re-signed the same grocery list 4 times in confusion. The petition claimed she wandered the property at night, calling for a husband dead 5 years. There was a photograph attached, taken from a distance, of me standing in the yard at dusk in my bathrobe. Renata would later establish that I had simply been calling in the cat, a fact the petition had declined to mention. None of it was quite a lie. All of it was staged or timed, or edited down from something true into something useful. The judge, working from paper and a recording clipped to 11 careful seconds, and a docket that gave her perhaps 4 minutes to weigh a woman's entire remaining autonomy, signed the temporary order the same afternoon. I found out about it the way most people find out their life has changed, from someone else's face, before anyone said a word. Renata called that evening, her voice flatter than I'd heard it. "It's temporary, 48 hours, an emergency placement pending full evaluation. I'm already filing to expedite an independent exam. But Gus, they can move you before that exam happens if they get there first." "Then I'd better be ready to be moved," I said, and I meant it in a way she didn't fully understand until 3 days later, when the van pulled into my driveway and I bent down to retie a boot that didn't need retying. Which brings us around, the long way, to where you found me, standing on my own porch, watching 2 strangers wait to carry my life out to a van, a folded scrap of paper pressed against my ankle, a radio sitting in a box on my own kitchen counter, like a joke somebody hadn't gotten around to laughing at yet. "I don't know this place," I said to Vanessa, softly, letting my eyes wander past her shoulder, as though I couldn't find the shape of her face. "Where's Josie? Is Josie coming?" Something flickered behind Vanessa's composure. Not guilt, not yet, but the recognition that a witness was missing and shouldn't be. "Josie's at school, Mother Calloway. You know that." "Do I said, and let the words trail into nothing, and watched the 2 transport men exchange the smallest of glances, the kind that says, "This one's worse than they told us." My phone buzzed once in my cardigan pocket. I didn't look at it. I already knew who it was and what it would say, because I had asked Renata the night before for exactly one thing: a window, however small, before those van doors closed on me. The window opened at 9:47 that morning. Renata's voice came through loud enough that the nearer transport man heard half of it. "Mrs. Calloway is subject to a court-ordered independent evaluation scheduled within 48 hours.
Any transport prior to that evaluation is a direct violation of the standing order, and I will have both your names and your company's license number in front of a judge by lunch."
Vanessa's clipboard dropped an inch before she caught it. "There's been a miscommunication," she said, to the men, to me, to no one. Her smile stayed exactly where it had been, which told me more about her than the smile itself ever could. The van doors stayed shut. The men drove away with an apology and an empty vehicle, and I stood on my own porch in the sudden quiet, watching Vanessa recalculate, and thought, not with satisfaction, not yet, only with the particular clarity of a nurse who has just watched a patient's vitals hold. 48 hours. That is exactly enough time, and not 1 hour more. That night, Josie called from a friend's phone, whispering, "Grandma, I heard Dad and Vanessa fighting. He found something in her office, a paper with your name on it, but the signature looked weird. He got really quiet."
Weird how, baby? Like when you sign your name fast at the pharmacy, but it wasn't your handwriting? It had your middle initial wrong. You always do the little loop on the G.
I sat very still with the phone against my ear, in a kitchen that no longer had a radio sitting on the counter, because I had moved it back out to the shed that morning, into a drawer, next to a folder Renata didn't yet know existed.
"You did good telling me that," I said. "Don't say anything to your dad about calling me. Not yet."
"Are you going to be okay, Grandma?" I looked at the empty spot on the counter where the box used to sit, at the window, at the long, dark shape of the land beyond it, that a woman in a sand-colored blazer believed was worth nothing more than the paper it would take to sell it.
"I've been in worse rooms than this one," I told my granddaughter. "Go to sleep."
The story behind Josie's phone call I only pieced together afterward, the way you reconstruct a fracture from an X-ray instead of watching the fall. Derek's discovery of the forged deposit agreement had happened earlier that same day, and it happened, as these things so often do, by accident rather than conscience. He was looking for a folder of tax documents in Vanessa's home office. His own explanation, later, under oath, was that he needed his W-2, and instead he found a real estate purchase agreement for 40 acres of Calloway land, buyer listed as a limited liability company he'd never heard of, seller signature at the bottom in handwriting that was almost, but not quite, his mother's.
"What is this?" he said, when Vanessa came in and found him holding it.
"It's just a formality, in case the sale goes through after the guardianship's finalized. Nothing's binding yet." This is her signature. "It's a placeholder, Derek. Attorneys do this all the time." He did not believe her. I know this because Josie told me, and because I watched it play out 3 weeks later in a much larger room, on a much larger man's face, when the same question was put to him under oath, and he could not make himself say the word yes with any conviction at all. But that night, in his own kitchen, Derek did not confront her the way the moment demanded. He put the paper back where he'd found it, and he went to bed, and he told himself, the way people do, when believing something is easier than acting on it, that he'd misunderstood something he wasn't equipped to understand. I did not know about the forged deposit agreement yet, not with certainty, not with a name and a dollar figure. What I had, 3 days after the van left empty, was an appointment with a neurologist named Amir Sato, arranged by Renata, under the county's expedited evaluation order, in an office with a fish tank in the waiting room, and a receptionist who called me Colonel without being asked to, because Renata, God bless her thoroughness, had made sure my full record made it into the file before I ever sat down. Renata met me in the parking lot beforehand, which she didn't have to do, and which told me something about her I hadn't fully understood over the phone. She was younger than her voice suggested, maybe 50, with a scar along one eyebrow she never explained and I never asked about. "I take these cases because my own grandmother lost a house to her nephew in 2009, she told me, leaning against her car while we waited for the office to open. Not dramatically, not like this, just papers, one at a time, until there was nothing left for her to sign that would have changed anything. Everyone said she was getting forgetful. She wasn't. She was just old, and nobody thought that was worth protecting anymore." She looked at me then, not with pity, which I would not have tolerated, but with something closer to recognition. "I don't lose these, Gus, not when I catch them in time."
"You didn't catch this one in time. The order's already signed."
"I caught it in time to matter," she said. "There's a difference, and you of all people know it." Inside, Dr. Sato was younger than I expected, and precise in a way I found immediately reassuring. The particular precision of someone who has learned not to let a room's tension change his procedure. He asked me to draw a clock face showing 10 past 11. He asked me to remember 3 words: apple, table, honesty, and then spent 5 unhurried minutes asking me about my service record, my medications, the layout of my property, before circling back, without warning, to ask for the words again.
Apple, table, honesty, I said without hesitation, and watched him make a small, unremarkable notation that would end up meaning everything.
Do you know why you're here today, Mrs. Calloway?
Colonel, I corrected gently, if we're being thorough, and I'm here because my daughter-in-law needs me to be someone I'm not, and this is the appointment where we find out I'm not going to cooperate.
He looked up from his clipboard for the first time since we'd started. It was the only moment in the entire examination where I saw something other than clinical neutrality cross his face. A flicker of something almost like admiration, quickly filed away, the way professionals file away everything that isn't strictly relevant to the chart. I answered every question accurately and without hesitation, because there was, in fact, nothing wrong with my mind, and pretending there was would have been not only dishonest but strategically insane at the one moment it mattered most to be believed. 3 days after that appointment, according to Renata, someone reached out to Dr. Sato's office, not directly, not clumsily, a call from a colleague of a colleague, the kind of favor that gets asked in a tone that implies it isn't really a favor at all, suggesting that a finding of mild cognitive concern warranting further supervision would be, in the current climate of family stress, the compassionate outcome for everyone involved. Dr. Sato declined. He put his refusal in writing, to Renata, the same afternoon, a single, unremarkable paragraph that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in this story. I found no clinical evidence of cognitive impairment. I declined to characterize my findings otherwise, and I want to note for the record that I was contacted regarding this case in a manner I considered inappropriate.
I did not learn who had made that call until much later. I have my suspicions, I have never confirmed them, and at a certain point I decided I did not need to.
The first full hearing came on a Tuesday, in a courtroom slightly larger than the one that had signed the emergency order, though not by much. Vanessa arrived in cream again. I noticed that, the way you notice a uniform, with a folder of her own and a lawyer named Fitch, who spoke in the reasonable, regretful tones of a man selling a car he knows has a bad transmission. Fitch opened by describing me the way you'd describe a house with a foundation problem, structurally sound-looking, dangerous underneath. The family has watched Mrs. Calloway's condition decline gradually and painfully over the past year, he told the judge, in the tone of a man reading from a script he'd polished until it no longer sounded like one. They've tried, repeatedly, to have this conversation with her directly. She has resisted every offer of help. This is not a family acting out of greed, Your Honor. This is a family acting out of love in the absence of any other option. She played the recording from that Thursday dinner, 11 seconds, clipped from an hour, my voice drifting off mid-sentence about the date of my own husband's death, a silence stretched just long enough by an editor's hand to sound like confusion instead of grief. She described nighttime wandering that had never happened. She cried, at the appropriate moment, with the particular control of someone who has rehearsed crying the way other people rehearse a toast, dabbing at one eye with a tissue she had, I noticed, already folded to the correct size before the hearing began. Renata objected to the recording's admissibility. She noted the absence of full context, the timestamp gaps, the chain of custody questions around a personal phone that had, conveniently, been reset for storage space the week prior. Judge Kell allowed it anyway, over objection, for the limited purpose of demonstrating family concern. And I watched something in the room's temperature shift, the way it shifts when you're losing a patient, and the numbers on the monitor haven't caught up to what your hands already know. Judge Kell did not rule that day. She set a final hearing for the following Thursday, and she said, in the careful, non-committal language judges use when they've already half-decided something, that she was inclined, absent compelling contrary evidence, to consider making the arrangement more permanent, in the interest of Mrs. Calloway's safety. Vanessa did not smile in the courtroom. She was too careful for that.
But in the hallway outside, when she thought I was still fumbling with my coat and couldn't hear her, she told Fitch in a voice loose with relief, "We're basically there. One more hearing and this is done."
That was the moment, more than any other, when I understood the shape of what Renata had told me weeks before. A person who believes she has already won stops being careful. Vanessa had stopped watching for me. I intended to make her regret that particular relaxation for a very long time.
The report reached Elena Cruz's desk 2 days later, in the ordinary, bloodless way that most consequential things reach a bureaucrat's desk. Not as a favor, but as a line item flagged for expedited review after a request routed down through her chain from someone several ranks above her pay grade. The kind of request that arrives without an explanation attached and doesn't need one. Elena was a contracting officer attached to the regional installation nearly 40 miles from Cedar Hollow, responsible, among other things, for monitoring the status of lessors under long-term federal land use agreements. Her office already ran quarterly checks against public court filings for any lessor whose name appeared on an active federal contract. This one simply moved to the top of the stack.
It was tedious work, the kind nobody thanks you for. Until the week, it isn't. Augusta R. Calloway, party to a 25-year strategic buffer lease, 41 acres, executed 15 years prior, renewal option exercised 11 years prior, current lease value across the full term approaching $47 million. And now, in the same week, the subject of an active guardianship proceeding in county court, with a temporary order already granted and a permanent order pending. Elena did not think of me as a person that afternoon. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to the shape of what happened next. She thought of me as a compliance flag, a lessor whose legal capacity to hold and administer a federal contract was, according to a state court filing, in active dispute. That flag triggered a review, not a rescue. Nobody in that building was thinking about an old woman on a porch. They were thinking about a $47 million instrument that required an accountable, competent counterparty, and a state court that appeared to be about to declare that counterparty incompetent based on evidence nobody at the installation had yet seen. It was only when Elena pulled the full case file, a formality, a box to check, that she found the second document sitting inside it, a real estate purchase agreement, 40 acres, buyer and LLC registered 11 days earlier, seller's signature dated a week before the guardianship petition was even filed. A sale of federally leased land, attempted, apparently, by someone other than the actual lessor. She called her supervisor into her cubicle without knocking, which was not something Elena Cruz did. "I need eyes on this before I send it anywhere," she said, turning her monitor around. "Because if I'm reading this right, somebody tried to sell 40 acres of federal buffer land out from under an active lease, using a signature that doesn't match the lessor's own bank records, 1 week before filing to have that same lessor declared legally incompetent." Her supervisor read it twice, the way Marcus Webb would read it twice an hour later, and said only, "Send it up. Today. Not tomorrow." That was no longer a compliance flag. That was fraud against a federal instrument, and it went up Elena's chain within the hour. It reached Marcus Webb's desk that same afternoon. He read it twice. He did not call me. He called Renata Ford's office instead, introduced himself with his full rank and title, and asked, with the particular courtesy of a man who has learned that courtesy is its own kind of leverage, whether the Calloway guardianship matter had a final hearing date, and whether the government of the United States, as an interested party to a federal lease potentially affected by that proceeding, would be permitted to file a notice of interest and appear. Renata told him yes. She also told him, quietly, that she'd wondered when someone from that direction might show up, and that she was glad it hadn't come sooner, because sooner would have looked like favoritism, and now it would look like exactly what it was. The final hearing was moved to a larger courtroom to accommodate the additional parties. I noticed that detail before I noticed almost anything else that morning. The size of the room, the extra chairs along the back wall, the way sound behaves differently in a space built to hold more grief than the last one could. Someone had propped the double doors open with a rubber wedge, an ordinary maintenance habit that would matter enormously in about 90 minutes, though nobody in that room, including me, knew it yet. Vanessa arrived early, composed, in cream once more. Derek arrived beside her, and did not look at me, and did not look entirely at her either. Fitch carried a folder, considerably thinner than the confidence on his face suggested it should be. Judge Kell opened by summarizing the record. Renata rose to object to portions of the temporary order's foundation and to introduce Dr. Sato's written findings, no clinical evidence of impairment, and a formal note regarding the outside contact he'd received. Fitch objected to the note's relevance. The judge allowed it, over objection, and something in the room's temperature shifted again, the way it does when the numbers on the monitor finally start to catch up.
Your Honor, Fitch said, recovering, regardless of Dr. Sato's clinical opinion, the family's concerns regarding Mrs. Calloway's judgment and vulnerability remain. Your Honor, Renata's voice, level, cutting cleanly across his. Before we proceed further, I need to call Mr. Derek Calloway.
Derek's face did something complicated when his name was said aloud. He stood, was sworn, sat again in the witness chair, looking like a man who had spent 3 weeks hoping he would never have to be exactly where he now was.
Mr. Calloway, I'm going to show you a document. Renata approached with a single sheet, already marked as an exhibit. Do you recognize this? He looked at it for longer than it required. I found something like this in my wife's office. Is that your mother's signature?
A silence stretched, the kind Vanessa had once manufactured on 11 seconds of recorded tape. Except this one was real, and nobody had edited it. And it went on long enough that Judge Kell finally said, gently, "Mr. Calloway, you're required to answer." "It looks like her signature," he said, "but the middle initial's wrong. She always does a little loop on the G. This doesn't have the loop." I have thought since about what it cost him to say that sentence, in front of his wife, in front of a judge, in front of a mother he had spent 3 weeks trying to convince himself was fading. I have decided it cost him something real, and that it was, nonetheless, 3 weeks too late.
It was at that moment, and I promise you I am not shaping this for effect, this is simply how it happened, that the courtroom doors at the back of the room opened, and a small delegation entered without ceremony. Elena Cruz, in a blazer far less expensive than Vanessa's and far more useful that morning. A JAG attorney named Captain Priya Anand, carrying a case file thick with the weight of federal paper. And, walking a half step behind them, a man in civilian clothes who nonetheless carried himself the way men carry themselves after 30 years of being saluted. Marcus Webb. Nobody stood and saluted him. This was not that kind of room, and he did not want it to be. He simply walked to the front, and Captain Anand addressed the judge with the flat, procedural courtesy of someone who has done this 100 times and understands it is not a performance.
Your Honor, may we approach? The United States, as a party to an active federal lease with the respondent, requests leave to file a notice of interest and to present relevant evidence regarding the respondent's legal capacity and the disposition of leased property.
Fitch was on his feet immediately, objecting to standing, to relevance, to the sheer improbability of the moment. Judge Kell allowed it. This was, after all, exactly the kind of compelling contrary evidence she had told the room she was waiting for. And Captain Anand laid 3 documents on the clerk's table in careful sequence. The first was the lease itself, portions redacted for security classification, but the essential terms intact. 41 acres, 25-year term, current valuation across the remaining life of the contract of $47 million. Augusta R. Calloway listed as sole lessor of record, and separately as a compensated civilian consultant to the installation's field medical training program, the source, at last named aloud, of the $9,000 monthly deposit Derek had photographed weeks before. The second was Elena Cruz's compliance report, flagging the guardianship petition as a direct threat to the government's ability to administer a federal instrument. The third was the purchase agreement Derek had found in his wife's office, now formally entered as evidence of an attempted unauthorized sale of federally leased land under a forged signature. A document examiner Renata had quietly retained the week before, a small, unhurried woman named Priscilla Wren, who had spent 30 years testifying about pen crusher and letter forms in courtrooms far less dramatic than this one, took the stand for 4 unglamorous minutes to confirm what Derek had already told the room without training. The loop was missing on the capital G, the baseline pressure was wrong, and the signature had, in her professional opinion, been traced rather than written. Traced from what? Judge Kell asked.
From a canceled check, Your Honor, dated 11 years earlier. Mrs. Calloway's actual signature has changed slightly with age, as most people's do.
This one hadn't. It was frozen in time, copied from a document the forger never expected anyone to compare it to. I watched Vanessa's face while all 3 documents were laid down. I want to tell you it collapsed all at once, dramatically, the way a face collapses in the kind of story that ends with somebody fainting in a courtroom aisle. It didn't. It went still first. A terrible, controlled stillness. The look of someone doing arithmetic she already knows won't come out in her favor. The kind of stillness that comes from doing that same arithmetic every night for 2 years, and always landing on the same wrong number. And only then, slowly, watching Priscilla Wren circle the missing loop on a projected image for the whole room to see, did the stillness crack.
Colonel Calloway, Judge Kell said, and I noted, quietly, that it was the first time in this entire proceeding anyone official had used my actual rank. Is there anything you'd like to say?
I stood. I did not perform confusion, because there was no longer any strategic reason to, and there is a particular relief in setting down a mask you've been wearing so carefully you'd started to worry about your own face underneath it. Only this, Your Honor. My daughter-in-law is not wrong that I'm 65 years old. She is not wrong that I live alone, or that a 41-acre property is a great deal for one woman to look after. What she was wrong about, what she never once bothered to check, was what that land was actually worth, and what I was actually still doing with the rest of my time. She assumed a woman my age had nothing left to offer anyone. She built an entire plan on that assumption, and she never once tested it.
Marcus Webb said very little. That, I think, was the most correct thing about his entire appearance that day. He did not deliver a speech. He did not describe our history in the sand 34 years apart. He said only, when the judge asked him to confirm the relationship on record, Colonel Calloway served as flight nurse on a medevac crew I was assigned to during Operation Desert Storm. I am here today in an official capacity, representing the interests of the United States government as a party to an active contract. I want the record to reflect that distinction clearly, because it matters, and because she would want it to matter too.
He looked at me only once, briefly, while Captain Anand finished laying out the lease documents, and I understood exactly what he was seeing, because I was thinking of the same photograph. A dust-streaked young lieutenant crouched beside a helicopter skid, waiting on a stretcher that had, that particular day, arrived in time. He had hung a copy of that same photograph somewhere in his own house, I would learn later, for 34 years, in a hallway his own grandchildren walked past every day without asking who the woman kneeling beside him was. Neither of us said any of that out loud in that courtroom. It wasn't the room for it, and he knew better than almost anyone alive exactly which room was and wasn't. Judge Kell took 11 minutes to review the documents in full silence, the room holding its breath around her, the way a bay holds its breath around a patient whose numbers have finally started climbing back toward the line. When she looked up, she addressed Vanessa directly.
Mrs. Calloway, the petition for permanent guardianship is denied, effective immediately. The temporary order is dissolved. I am additionally referring the purchase agreement dated the 14th to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential forgery and fraud, and I am notifying the State Real Estate Licensing Board of these proceedings pending further findings.
Vanessa did not say anything. There was, for the first time since I had known her, nothing left in her folder that would help. They took her out through a side door 20 minutes later. Not in handcuffs. That would come after, quietly, on a Wednesday morning I did not attend, but with a bailiff on one side of her and Fitch murmuring something into his phone on the other, already, I suspect, negotiating his own exit from the case. Derek stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, alone, staring at nothing, the folder with his mother's forged signature still in his hand, because no one had thought to take it from him.
I walked past him. I did not stop, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I genuinely did not yet know what I wanted to say. And I have learned across a long career and a longer life that the things you say before you know what you mean tend to cost more than the silence would have.
He caught up with me at the elevator. "Mom."
I turned.
"I didn't know," he said, "about the sale agreement. Not really. I saw it, and I told myself it was nothing, because believing you were nothing was easier than believing my wife had done something like this."
"I know," I said. "That's the part that's going to be hardest for you to live with.
Not that you didn't know, that you had every chance to.
He didn't argue. That, more than anything he said that day, was the first sign I had that something in him might eventually be worth rebuilding.
The ruling closed the case. It did not close the story. There were still 3 things I needed to see through before I'd let myself call any of this finished. What happened to Vanessa, what happened to Derek, and what happened to the 40 acres itself.
The district attorney's investigators found the rest of it within a month, the part even Derek hadn't known to look for. Vanessa's brokerage had been quietly failing for the better part of 2 years, propped up by a line of credit she'd personally guaranteed, and a string of deals that had fallen through one after another. By the time she filed the guardianship petition, she owed just over $340,000 to a lender who had stopped returning her calls with anything resembling patience. 40 acres, sold quietly to a shell company for a fraction of what it was actually worth, would have covered that debt with enough left over to make the whole disaster disappear before anyone at her firm noticed the hole. She had not been building an empire.
She had been bailing water out of a boat she'd already sunk, and she had decided at some point in that slow drowning that the fastest bucket available was an old woman she'd convinced herself didn't matter anymore.
Vanessa was formally charged 11 weeks later with forgery and financial exploitation of an elderly person. Her real estate license was suspended pending the outcome, and by the terms of a plea agreement reached the following spring, permanently revoked. Derek was not charged. He had signed nothing false, forged nothing, sold nothing, but the court terminated any standing power of attorney he'd been granted years earlier over routine household matters, and Renata made certain in a separate civil filing that his access to any part of my estate was restructured in a way that required my direct, ongoing, unmistakably competent consent for anything larger than a birthday check.
I did not cut him off entirely. I want to be honest about that too, because I think a story is only useful if it tells you the truth about how repair actually works, which is slower and less satisfying than revenge stories generally admit. He is allowed to see Josie, under terms Josie herself helped set. He comes to Cedar Hollow twice a month, and we do not talk about Vanessa, and we do not talk, yet, about the folder he carried out of that courtroom. We talk about the roof on the equipment shed, which needs replacing, and about whether Josie should get a dog, and about small, unimportant things that are, in fact, the entire structure of a relationship being rebuilt one unremarkable Tuesday at a time. The first time he came back, 6 weeks after the hearing, he stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a long moment before he came up, the way you stand at the edge of water you're not sure is safe to enter. "I keep thinking about the loop," he said, finally, not looking at me. "The one on the G. I must have seen your real signature 10,000 times in my life, Mom. Birthday cards, permission slips, and I still almost let myself believe the fake one, because believing it was easier than believing what it meant about the person I married."
You don't have to keep explaining it to me, Derek.
"I'm not explaining it to you," he said. "I'm trying to figure out how to explain it to Josie someday, when she's old enough to ask why her father let it get that far." I didn't have an answer for that one, and I told him so, which was, I think, more useful to him than any answer I could have invented. Renata closed my file the following spring, which for her, she told me over coffee at a diner off Route 9, was its own small ceremony. Most of her cases end in loss, incremental and permanent. An old woman moved somewhere she didn't choose, a house sold out from under her before anyone thought to ask if she agreed. "You're the file I keep in the front of the drawer," she said. "The one I pull out when a new client asks whether any of this is worth fighting. Most days I'm not entirely sure. Yours is the answer I give them."
You should charge extra for that.
"I do," she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she laughed, unguarded, the sound of someone setting a weight down she hadn't realized she'd been carrying into every single appointment. "I used part of the lease's renewal payment. The government, it turned out, was more than willing to formalize an arrangement it had already been quietly relying on for years, to convert the back 40 acres, the ones Vanessa had once called dead weight, into something with an actual name on a sign at the gate, the Cedar Hollow Veterans Recovery Retreat. 6 cabins, a physical therapy pavilion, a stable for equine work with soldiers whose nervous systems needed something a hospital couldn't offer them. Dr. Sato consults there now, 1 afternoon a week for no charge, which he has never once let me thank him for properly. Josie spends most of her summer there. Last month, cleaning out the equipment shed with her, we found the old radio again, sitting in the drawer where I'd hidden it during the worst of it, dust thick on the dial, like it had never worked a day in its life. A young veteran named Ruiz was helping us clear brush that afternoon, 24 years old, 3 tours, hands that hadn't stopped shaking since his second one.
Does it still work? Josie asked me, the same question she'd asked weeks before all of this began.
I turned the dial. Static. Then a thin thread of a signal from somewhere out past the ridge. I looked at Ruiz, at his hands, at the particular stillness that comes over a person when they're handed something with a purpose instead of a diagnosis.
It works, I told her. It just needed somebody to ask it to. I gave it to him. He didn't say much. He didn't need to.
Frank would have liked Ruiz, I think. My husband spent 40 years fixing tractors for men who couldn't always say what was actually wrong with them, only that something was. And he had a way of listening to an engine the way I'd learned to listen to a patient, for the thing underneath the thing they were telling you. He died 5 years ago this past March, on a Tuesday, and it did rain, exactly the way I told Vanessa it did, though I never told her how many hours I sat afterward in the truck in our driveway before I could make myself go back inside a house that was suddenly only mine. I think about him more at the retreat than I do anywhere else on this property now, which surprised me the first few times it happened. He would have found something to fix out there every single day, and he would have been quietly, thoroughly furious about what almost happened to me, in the particular way he reserved for injustices that couldn't be repaired with a wrench. I've made my peace with the fact that I'll never know exactly what he would have said. I only know he would have been standing beside me in that courtroom, and that not having him there was its own private cost the story doesn't get to erase, however it ends. I still live alone on Cedar Hollow, most days, though the property doesn't feel empty the way it used to before all this started. I am not interested in telling you that everything is healed, because it isn't. Not with Derek, not entirely, and I don't believe stories that claim otherwise. What I can tell you is that nobody signs anything on my behalf anymore without my full, documented, thoroughly evaluated consent, and that the acreage a family once called worthless is now the reason a young man with shaking hands has somewhere quiet to put them.
If somebody in your life has ever decided your age or your circumstances or the quiet shape of your daily routine meant you had nothing left worth protecting, I'd like you to know that assumption is the mistake, not the age. It was for me. It usually is. The people who underestimate us rarely do the arithmetic before they act. They see the surface of a life, the small house, the old radio, the routine nobody bothers to ask about, and they mistake quiet for empty. It is very rarely empty. It is just quiet on purpose, sometimes for reasons that took 30 years to build and about 10 minutes to prove. If this story found something true in your own life, if someone ever looked at you and decided you'd stopped mattering and you had to prove them wrong with evidence instead of anger, I'd like to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want more stories about the people families underestimate and what happens when that underestimation finally meets its evidence, stay close. There's more where this came from.